Hi there, welcome to my YouTube channel Dhyani classes. If you are watching my video for the first time, do subscribe my channel, hit the bell icon so that you get notified whenever new video will be uploaded. So in today's video we will cover the second part of the chapter, the last lesson written by Alphonse Daudet from class 12 CBSE. So let's get started. So in the first part of the chapter we have learned that the little Franz started understanding value and importance of these books such as grammar book and history book and the value of his mother tongue, and it was the French language. And then at the same time he also did not want to lose his teacher M. Hamel, and he was feeling very sad for his teacher M. Hamel, and then he started feeling nice to his teacher and forgot all about his ruler and how cranky he was. And later on he also understood that why the blessed people were sitting inside the classroom and understood that they are not going to learn French language anymore in their school, and realized that he had also not used the opportunity to go to the school and learn French language. So let's look at the final part of the chapter with line by line explanation now. It was their way of thanking our master for his 40 years of faithful service and of showing their respect for the country that was theirs no more. So here the author is saying that it was their way of thanking our master for his 40 years of faithful service. That means he understood that why the village people were sitting in the classroom, because they wanted to thank his teacher M. Hamel, as he had been teaching French language for 40 years in their village school, and also showing their respect for the country that was theirs no more. So village people wanted to show their respect to the teacher and to show respect for their own language and also show respect to their own country which was no more theirs because it was occupied by the Germans. And says, while I was thinking of all this, I heard my name called. It was my turn to recite. So here when little Franz was thinking why village people were sitting inside the classroom and why his teacher M. Hamel put on this special dress on this day and all, and says, I heard my name called. So it was my turn to recite. That means as he was thinking, immediately his teacher called his name and he understood that it was his turn to recite the participles. So recite means quote or speak of something. Further he says, what would I not have given to be able to say that dreadful rule for the participle all through, very loud and clear and without one mistake. So here he is saying that he was in deep thought of learning his own language and wanted to recite participle very clearly and out loud and even without making any mistake, but he was not able to utter a single word because there are so many thoughts were running in his mind. And says, but I got mixed up on the first words and stood there holding on to my desk, my heart beating and not daring to look up. So as he wanted to recite participles but he mixed up on the first words, that means he got confused on the first words and stood there helpless while holding his desk and saying he was not daring to look up. So he was not able to recite the participles, so he stood there holding to his desk and his heart was beating and not daring to look up because he was frightened that the teacher M. Hamel would scold him. So he did not have the courage to make eye contact with his teacher M. Hamel. I heard M. Hamel say to me, I won't scold you, little Franz, you must feel bad enough. So here he is saying that when he was standing holding his desk, his teacher M. Hamel came closer to him and said very politely that I won't scold you, little Franz, you must feel bad enough. That means you should feel bad because you are not able to give answer properly, and it's okay. I'm not going to scold you today. And says, see how it is. So he told little Franz that look at yourself how frightened you are. Even this is your own mother tongue and you are not able to speak anything about your mother language because you did not learn it properly. And says, every day we have said to ourselves, bah, I have plenty of time, I'll learn it tomorrow. So here he is talking about the general attitude of people there. Bah, I have plenty of time. That means he used to think that I have plenty of time to learn French language and tried to postpone things or let me learn it tomorrow. So this is how he used to postpone his classes, especially French grammar lessons. And says, and now you see where we have come out. So now his teacher M. Hamel told him that look at yourself, where are you now? And you are looking very poor and helpless at this time. So M. Hamel wanted to say this thing to the village people as well, that you people never paid attention to your mother language or mother tongue, and now you people are looking very helpless and see your condition now, and that you are not able to tell anything about your language properly. Further he says, that's the general trouble with Alsace, she puts off learning till tomorrow. So here he is saying that that's the great trouble with Alsace. That means this is very unfortunate for the people from Alsace, and that they are not going to learn their mother tongue, and says she puts off learning till tomorrow. That means people in Alsace did not use right time to learn their own language, and that is the great trouble for everybody in Alsace, and don't know how to write and speak French, because no more French will be taught going forward in Alsace. And says, now those fellow out there will have the right to say to you how it is you pretend to be Frenchmen, and yet you can neither speak nor write your own language. So his teacher M. Hamel is saying, now those fellows out there will have the right to say to you, that means Germans will have right to tell you, or they will ask you how it is you pretend to be Frenchmen, and yet you can neither speak nor write your language. That means the Germans will come to you and tell you that you are looking French, but still you are not able to speak or write French language properly. So in this way they will make fun of you all, because French language is your own language. Further he says, but you are not the worst, poor little France, we've all a great deal to reproach ourselves with. So here the author is saying that, but you are not the worst. That means France teacher M. Hamel is telling France that you are not the only here who is feeling sad and sorry, even we all a great deal to reproach ourselves with. That means everybody in the whole class and outside of the class is feeling very sad and disappointed, because we were not able to learn our mother tongue properly. So we all have to feel disappointed with ourselves, and says your parents were not anxious enough to have you learn. So his teacher blaming the parents, that the parents were not anxious enough to have you learn. That means they were not concerned or bothered about to know your own mother tongue, and saying your parents did not want you to learn because they preferred to put you to work on a farm or at mills so as to have a little more money. So M. Hamel blaming parents as well, that they prefer to put you work on a farm or at the mills. That means instead of sending you to school, they put on you to work on a farm or the mills in order to have a little more money. So in this way M. Hamel blaming their parents also, that they are also a root cause of their children's disappointment, and says, and I have been to blame also. So here he also blaming himself, not only parents, and somehow he was also responsible for that. And why he is saying, let's look at the next slide. Have I not often sent you to water my flowers instead of learning your lessons? So here the teacher M. Hamel blaming himself by saying, have I not often sent you to water my flowers? That means he used to send the children to water his flowers instead of learning their lessons. So he is also responsible for why the children are still unable to understand their own language, and in this way he is blaming himself and saying, and when I wanted to go fishing, did I not just give you a holiday? So the teacher gave another example of how he is responsible for that, and says, and when I wanted to go fishing, that means whenever he wanted to go catching the fish, he used to give a holiday to the children. So he realized that he did not give them an opportunity to learn French language, and says, then from one thing to another, M. Hamel went on to talk of the French language, saying that it was the most beautiful language in the world, the clearest, the most logical. So after blaming himself and the parents, he started talking about the French language and its importance to the children, and says it was the most beautiful language in the world. So he started talking about the French language, that this language is most beautiful language in the world, as well as it is the clearest and most logical language in the world. That means language that makes sense and easy to understand according to the teacher M. Hamel. Further it says that we must guard it among us and never forget it. So here the teacher M. Hamel is saying that we must guard it. That means we must protect our own language, and telling the student and the people who are sitting inside the classroom that all of you safeguard your language and never forget it, because it is the mother tongue. And why M. Hamel is saying like this? because when people are enslaved, as long as they hold fast to their language, it is as if they had the key to their prison. So as per the teacher, if you know your mother tongue, it will help a lot when people are enslaved. That means when you are losing your freedom, your mother tongue will help you out. And says as long as they hold fast to their language, it is as if they had the key to their prison. That means if you know your mother tongue, it can help you to get out of the prison. So in this way, he is saying that your mother tongue is so powerful and it can help you to great extent. Even it is the key to get out from the prison, and it is very important to safeguard mother tongue for every citizen of this country as well as whichever country you are. And says then he opened a grammar and read us our lesson. So after briefing all about the French language, M. Hamel opened a grammar book and taught them a lesson in grammar, and says, I was amazed to see how well I understood it. So here Franz is saying that he was so surprised to see how easily his teacher made them understand the grammar lesson, and it was very easy for him to understand. So amazed means to be astonished or great surprised. All he said seemed so easy, so easy. So here the author is saying that all he said seemed so easy. That means whatever his teacher M. Hamel was teaching at that time, it was so easy to understand, because earlier he never paid attention what his teacher used to teach him, but now he is really worried about his own language and wanted to learn it. And why he is saying it seemed so easy? Because I think too that I had never listened so carefully, and that he had never explained everything with so much patience. So now he is thinking that I think I had never listened so carefully. That means he is thinking now why he is saying it is so easy to understand, because earlier he never listened carefully, but this time he was listening very attentively with full concentration, and that's why he was able to understand French language easily. And says that he had never explained everything with so much patience. So he says that this time his teacher M. Hamel was explaining the lesson with so much patience, and that's why he was able to get the meaning of everything whatever he was teaching at that time in the class. And students were also listening him very attentively, and that's why he is saying that everything was so easy to understand. And says it seemed almost as if the poor man wanted to give us all he knew before going away, and to put it all into our heads at one stroke. So here the Franz calling his teacher a poor man, and telling that it seemed almost as if he wanted to give us all he knew before going away. That means his teacher was trying very hard to teach them whatever he knew before leaving the class, and to put it all into our heads at one stroke. That means he wanted to download each and everything all about the grammar lesson into the head in one shot. After the grammar, we had a lesson in writing. So Franz is saying that after the grammar lesson, his teacher started teaching something in writing, and says that day M. Hamel had new copies for us, written in a beautiful round hand, Franz Alsace, Franz Alsace. So on the last day of grammar lesson, his teacher M. Hamel had a new copies for us. That means he brought some new notepad or copies for them, and says written in a beautiful round hand, Franz Alsace, Franz Alsace. That means his teacher had a new copies in which it was written Franz Alsace, Franz Alsace in a beautiful round hand. That means in a beautiful handwriting. And when he looked at the written notepad, they looked like little flags floating everywhere in the schoolroom, hung from the road at the top of our desk. So here he is saying that written notepads were looking like a flag floating everywhere in the schoolroom, because it was beautifully written and hung from the rod at the top of the desk. Further he says, you ought to have seen how everyone set to work and how quiet it was. So here he is saying that it was very surprising thing to see inside the classroom, that everybody was sitting very quietly and how everyone set to work. That means every student was doing their work very attentively, and they were too busy in their work, and it was completely silence inside the classroom, and that was the surprising thing for him. And says the only sound was the scratching of the pens over the paper. So here at the same time he could hear only the sound of the scratching of the pen. That means Students were writing something over the paper and only scratching sound was coming inside the classroom. Even his teacher M. Hamel was also sitting on the chair very silently and says, once some beetles flew in, but nobody paid any attention to them, not even the latest one. So here he is saying that once some beetles flew in, that means as they were writing over the paper, suddenly some beetles flew inside the classroom, but nobody paid any attention to them. That means nobody cared about the beetles. Even small children also did not bother to look at the beetles, and says who worked right on tracing their fish hooks as if that was French too. So here he is saying that these beetles or these little children were looking so busy in their work and did not bother to look at the beetles and tracing their fish hooks. That means they were so busy writing with spelling accurately as if that was French too. So because it was the last day of teaching French, and that's why they were giving so much importance to their own language, and it was French. On the roof, the pigeon cawed very low, and I thought to myself, will they make them sing in German, even the pigeons? So here he is saying that on the roof, the pigeon cawed very low. That means there were pigeons sitting on the roof and making very low sounds. And then, while seeing the pigeons, he thought, will they make them sing in German? That means he thought that Germans who had imposed their language on French will make the pigeons going even in German. So this is what he was thinking in his mind, just because of he was frightened and concerned about losing his own mother tongue, and saying, whenever I looked up from my writing, I saw M. Hamel sitting motionless in his chair and gazing first at one thing then at another. So he was looking at his teacher M. Hamel from his desk, and his teacher was sitting in his chair motionless. That means he was sitting very silently or stock still and gazing first at one thing and then at another. So M. Hamel was looking at one thing that were there inside the classroom and did not move at all, and says as if he wanted to fix his mind just how everything looked in that little schoolroom. So as for the France, his teacher was looking steadily at one thing without moving at all, and he was looking as if he wanted to fix his mind on one thing or on wondering something about how everything looked in the little classroom. So M. Hamel was also very concerned and disappointed and sad because somehow he was also responsible for not teaching them lesson properly. Further, he says fancy for 40 years he had been there in the same place with his garden outside the window and his class in front of him, just like that. So here he is saying that fancy, that means just imagine that for 40 years he had been here in the same place. That means his teacher M. Hamel had been a teacher in the same school for 40 years, and outside of the classroom he had occupied his garden, which could be seen through the window from his classroom, and his class in front of him. So in this way he is saying everything was same, and says only the desk and benches had been worn smooth. So over 40 years there were some small changes that had taken place, and it was only the desk and benches worn out and had become smooth from each corner because of the opening and closing the desk. And says the walnut trees in the garden were taller, and the hope pine that he had planted himself twined about the window to the roof. So here he is talking about the plants which M. Hamel had planted in his garden, that the walnut tree had grown taller, and he had also planted hope pine, that means twinning stem of the top of the hope, and it twinned about the window, that means it climbed up through the window to the roof. So these were the changes that took place in the last 40 years. How it must have broken his heart to leave at all, poor man. So here Franz is saying that his teacher was feeling very sad and disappointed because it was his last lesson in this school where he had been working for the last 40 years, and says it must have broken his heart to leave at all. That means he was feeling very sad because of this bad news to leave everything. And Franz was also feeling very sad. He was feeling he should have felt very sad to hear this sad news, and now he is going to leave the school, and it would have been a big shock for him. So Franz was also feeling very sorry for his teacher M. Hamel, and says to hear his sister moving about in the room above packing their trunks. So while thinking about all this, he heard a sound coming from upstairs because His teacher's sister was packing their trunks, and one could hear the sound from the classroom and says, for they must leave the country next day. So why his sister was packing belongings? Because they were getting ready to leave the country next day. So that's why she was packing pieces of stuffs in a hurry, and he could hear the sound and says, but he had the courage to hear every lesson to the very last. So as he could hear the noise from the upstairs, but he had managed to hear the lesson very attentively because it was the last lesson, and from the next day onwards German is going to be taught in the classroom. After the writing we had a lesson in history, and then the babies chanted their ba be bi bo bu. So here he is saying that after the writing class they had a lesson in history as well, and then the babies chanted their ba be bi bo bu. That means small children started reading out loud some French basic language alphabets, and says down there at the back of the room old Hauser had put on his spectacles and holding his primer in both hands spelled the letter with them. So he looked back at the class where the old Hauser, that means old man, was sitting, and he had on his spectacles and holding his primer in both hands. That means he was holding his old basic grammar book and spelled the letter with them. So the old man started reading out loud the basic French alphabets from the book along with the small children in the classroom. Further he says you could see that he too was crying. So here the author is saying that the old Hauser, who was sitting back of the class, was also feeling very sad because he was very concerned and worried about his own language, that his children will not be able to learn French anymore, and says his voice trembled with emotion, and it was so funny to hear him that we all wanted to laugh and cry. So this old man was chanting words along with the small children, and while chanting his voice trembled with emotion. That means his voice quivering and emotions, and says it was so funny to hear him that all we wanted to laugh and cry. That means while looking at the old man, Franz wanted to laugh because his facial expression of the old man, but at the same time Franz also felt very sad, and everybody in the classroom was very sad, especially the village people, because they were very concerned about their own mother tongue. So everybody was overcome with emotions because it was their last French lesson and could not learn the lesson anymore, and says, how will I remember it, that last lesson. All at once the church clock struck 12. So the author is saying that how well I remember that means still he remembered his last lesson, because on that day he was feeling very sad and overcame with emotion, and then as he was thinking the church clock struck 12. And now he is saying then the Angelus. So here he is saying that then the Angelus, that means a prayer started right after church clock struck at 12. So Angelus also refers to Roman Catholic devotion or a prayer. So he could hear the prayer at the same time, and says at the same moment the trumpets of Prussian returning from drill sounded under our windows. So as soon as he heard the clock sound, at the same time the trumpets of Prussian returning from a drill, that means Russian-Prussian soldiers who were practicing in the open field back of the sawmill started playing music instrument loudly, and says M. Hamel stood up very pale in his chair. So his teacher, as soon as he heard the trumpets of the Prussian or the prayer, then he stood up from his chair, and he was looking very pale. That means his face was looking very dull and lethargic, and says I never saw him look so tall. So his teacher stood up very first time Franz saw him and in a standing position, and says he was looking very tall, and says my friends, said he, I, but something choked him, he could not go on. So his teacher M. Hammer wanted to say something to class, but he was unable to speak properly because he was overcome with emotion, and only said I, but something choked him and he could not go. So he was very sad and filled with emotions because it was the last lesson he was teaching, and that's why he was not able to speak anymore except I. Further he says, then he turned to the blackboard, took a piece of chalk, and bearing on with all his might, he wrote as large as he could, Viva la France. So here the author is saying that then he turned to the blackboard. That means his teacher turned towards the blackboard because he was not able to speak just because of emotions, and he took a piece of chalk and bearing with all his might, that means he picked up a piece of chalk and he started writing something on the blackboard with immense force, and he wrote as large as he could, Viva la France. That means he wrote with all his force in large letter, Long live France. And says then he stopped and leaned his head against the wall, and without a word he made a gesture to us with his hand, school is dismissed, you may go. So after writing Long live France, he stood up there for a moment and his head was against the wall, and without a word, that means without saying anything, he made a gesture to us with his hand. So he raised his head and lifting his hand and made a gesture that school is dismissed and you may go. That means he told everybody now you can go home and school is dismissed for the day. So from this lesson we can see the pain has undergone by the citizen of these two states, Alsace and Lorraine, after being enforced to speak and learn some other language, that is German, and how Germans had imposed their language on these people and they will not get a chance to learn their own mother tongue, that is French. So it is very difficult for the people to learn other languages, and at the same time we can understand how the teachers and the students were not serious to learn their own mother tongue and always postponed their learning, and they never took their opportunity to learn their own language, and then everybody in Alsace and Lorraine was suffering great pain and loss. So this is the end of the chapter, the last lesson written by Alphonse Daudet. I hope you like the video. For more informative videos, do subscribe my channel, hit the bell icon so that you get notified whenever new video will be uploaded. So thank you so much for watching once again. Stay safe, stay healthy.